Hello, everyone. Here we are on Sunday. Thank you for joining me. Um, so today I want to start out with just a couple of shout outs. Number one, make sure you have headphones ready. As I've said before, many of the sounds that I play as samples on this live stream are filled with a lot of very low frequencies, and those low frequencies won't play through your cell phone and they won't play through your laptop. They pretty much require headphones or earbuds to reproduce the low frequencies so that you can hear the whole thing properly. Besides, we're using headphones and binaural beats in order to do this brain entrainment synchronicity aspect between the two hemispheres. So that's kind of important. The other thing is, please know that I'm doing these live streams on Facebook and my own YouTube channel and Instagram. So if you have friends who are on those platforms and want to tune in, then they can tune in on those platforms. The Instagram is a pretty simple one. It's at Dr. Jeffrey Thompson. Pretty simple. I'm also part of another summit that's coming up. And that summit is this one here. It's One Habit to Beat Cancer. It's a whole day-long program of many experts on holistic approaches to cancer and all kinds of different advices to cancer, and a lot of different people who have gone through that process and have survived. It's headed up by a really good guy, Cort Davies, C-O-R-T, Davies. You might look him up and look up his TED Talk. Basically, you know, that, and it goes kind of beyond cancer. It's really my core belief as well, that the ultimate cause of all disease is stress. The body's ability to neutralize stresses coming from physical stresses, emotional stresses, self-defeating belief system stresses, spiritual stresses, all of those kind of things. So that's a good series. I don't think there's anybody that any of us know who hasn't been touched by having a family member or somebody that they know with that process. So it's a good resource. And Cort Davies is doing really good work with that. Today we're going to talk about the Sri Yantra, and not just the Sri Yantra, but an extension of what I had talked about before with primordial sounds, the concept of primordial sounds. And the core idea here is that someplace deep inside of me is a biological organic intelligence that knows how to grow my body out of two cells and differentiate the tissues into all the systems that work now, that is me, and then make them all run on automatic without my rational mind thinking about it or knowing anything about what's going on under the hood. And that biological wisdom, that something that has the knowledge to do this and then monitor it and make it run to make me be alive, tends to be the kind of experience that we associate with extraordinary experiences, spiritual epiphanies, enlightenment kind of experiences, same kind of experiences described throughout history with the use of sacred medications like ayahuasca and mescaline and mushrooms, later to be synthesized in the late 50s into LSD and other kind of chemical compounds that have a deep effect on the brain and awareness and cosmic consciousness and things like that. the kind of reports that come back from all these different various groups tend to have similar concepts, similar experiences, and those experiences all tend to be about who I think I am tends to dissolve, and I land in a deeper part of myself, which I call the big mind, small mind, big mind. And big mind is what the kahunas had talked about as being before a thought, being more here in the present moment, simultaneous with what's happening to me, instead of my rational thinking mind, which has an opinion or a context or a definition or an extra thought about what did just happen. So if you think about the fact that the present moment is all that actually exists, then that means that who I think I am is never actually real. That no matter how hard I try to think myself into the present moment, I will never actually get here, because it takes time to fire neurons of a thought. And even though it's a fraction of a second of neuron firings to fire a thought, I'm still a fraction of a second always late from now. So it means that when we talk about various cultures on the planet that have talked about various meditation techniques in order to get this part kind of out of the way so I can access the big mind part, which is closer into the moment, and synchronize with everything that's happening now without words and before a thought, and with no definitions and with no interpretations, it tends to be more of an objective experience, an experience that is beyond what we normally consider to be happiness or sadness or joy or fear. It's more of a neutral, objective state that's filled with bliss. And the word bliss has a new kind of meaning. It's not the normal thing where we have bliss associated with joy. It's a new meaning that's hard to describe. It's an ecstatic state. That's what I call it. So various cultures have used all kinds of different means in order to speed up the process of learning how to achieve that kind of state. Various forms of meditation. Every culture has come up with their own method. And when we analyze those methods, as I've said before in past live streams, when we analyze various types of meditation practices for various cultures, and we analyze the brain waves, we hook you up to EEG machines and brain mapping computers, and we look to see what happens in the brain when you achieve this certain type of high meditation state from India or from Tibet or, from various cultures. We see that different types of meditation practices lead to similar states, but through a different kind of meditation practice doorway. So I kind of call it, there's the big God room, and the room has a whole bunch of doors that go to the same room, and each one of those doors is a different type of meditation practice from a different culture. And each one of those meditation practices has a different brainwave pattern associated with it. Some of them tend to be high amplitudes in alpha, or theta, or delta, or epsilon, or gamma. The more recent discoveries with the default mode network and cosmic consciousness, where the 4 zones of the default mode network synchronize up and form something called the default mode function of the brain, where 95% of the function of the brain takes place. And what we can normally consider to be our rational thinking mind and our regular experience in life, like me talking to you and you listening to me, is only 5% off the top of what's really going on under the hood. And with the tools of sound and brain entrainment, and sound, has been the primary tool used in every culture on the planet, including indigenous cultures. There's always a sound tradition, and the sound tradition always is centered on a focus of spirituality and waking up and becoming more self-aware. Healing tends to be the door prize. The underlying this whole idea of being out of my rational thinking mind and into my big holographic mind that doesn't think linearly. It seems to be more of the Newtonian mind and the quantum mind, where time doesn't have the same kind of meaning, where position in time and space is different than what we normally logically think of. Higher dimensional states look back on previous dimensional states as a three-dimensional object casts a two-dimensional shadow, and a four-dimensional object casts a three-dimensional shadow, which would be kind of what we are. These are the kind of experiences that come up in advanced states of meditation, of living that, experiencing that directly. And that's the effort that human beings have always been trying to make, in this case using sound in order to accentuate and help that process. And now that we are in the 21st century with new tools and new high-tech abilities to measure the brain and to create advanced sound equipment that can split sound into micro divisions of sound frequencies. So, for instance, I'm sitting in my living room, which isn't a living room. It's a high-tech digital recording studio, and I can split sound into a number of decimal points of accuracy. I do that in my clinic and measure your body, measure your autonomic nervous system on a computer screen, can measure your brain with brainwaves, and I can split sounds to micro frequencies and micro tunings and watch its effect on your state of consciousness, your brain, how your nervous system functions, and I can use that for healing, and I can use it for expanding consciousness. And if we see research projects in various universities across the world that hook meditators up to EEG devices, and we watch what happens with your brainwaves when you're in a certain state of meditation, high state of meditation, and we begin to see repetitive patterns of brain activity associated with different types of high states of meditation, we can reproduce those brain states in the brain using sound as a brainwave entrainment tool. And like I said before, we can use sound and light and electromagnetic fields to induce brain patterns. I use all three in my clinic and my research. I produce soundtracks, generic soundtracks based on entrainment to various frequencies. In my personal practice, I tune those frequencies specifically to your brain. It's no longer a bell curve, it's no longer generic, it's very specific to you. And underlying all of this talk about the small mind and the big mind, the big mind is when you have an ecstatic state experience and mesh with big mind and synchronize with the present moment, everything changes but stays the same. What changes is my definitions for things fall away. My considerations of things fall away. My attitudes, my definitions, my thoughts about my attitudes disappear. And there's a new state that emerges. And within that state is the recognition that something inside of each of us is ancient and timeless and unimaginably wise and has all the answers to all the questions that small mind would ever want to ask. But they're all happening at once. It's a massive hologram. It's a thing that is experienced simultaneously in a way that small mind has a hard time wrapping itself around. There's a level of understanding and ecstatic connection that defies definitions in words that might be associated with emotions. Yes, small mind would say that I had an incredible emotional response. But while I'm having that response, it doesn't read as emotional, it reads as ecstatic, as awe, as some word that defies definition. But being able to see that from this standpoint of large mind, the universe is filled with patterns, mathematical patterns, that the universe is based on math. And the types of math throughout history in different cultures have been called sacred math, sacred geometry, sacred relationships, sacred patterns. And various cultures have attempted to make those patterns as works of art, and in particular as works of art that aid meditation, a visual way of aiding meditation. So we're talking about sound, and this is using light, this is using eyes, this is using art. And for instance, in India, those were called Yantras. Some cultures it's called mandalas. They are designs that tend to be symmetrical and that tend to be mathematical, and tends to be certain types of sacred mathematical relationships and geometries. And when you dig into them, you find out that these are the geometries of nature. These are the geometries arising from certain mathematical types of formulas that nature uses to design natural systems. And my body is one of these natural systems, so my body is a textbook of universal law. And all those mathematical relationships and sacred geometries are represented here. Part of the big reason why I wanted to go to school, to chiropractic school, was to learn the anatomy and physiology in the nth degree of scientific knowledge, and chemistry and biology and things like that, and because I knew that the universal textbook of universal law is buried here, and if I could expose myself to the highest degree of that level of information, I would be able to come in contact with a deeper level of understanding of what's here, what's here in my own body, and what's here in my own reality. I must say I was not disappointed. There wasn't a day that went by in school that was not some new mind blower that had to do with mathematical relationships and esoteric information that I had learned from the past in my own searches and studies. So, you know, back in, let's say 567 to 490 BC was Pythagoras and his Pythagorean school in Samos Island off the coast of Italy. And that, kind of master esoteric school was exploring these divine, sacred, mathematical relationships that form geometries. And a lot of those had to do directly with sound. And if you look here on the left diagram, that was called the Pythagorean monochord. And basically it was like a guitar neck with a single string. You can see the little hand coming out of the cloud there with the tuning peg, and there's one string going down the middle, and that string is divided up with mathematical measurements. So there's the length of that string from bridge at the bottom to bridge at the top. And then there are different mathematical measurements, like exactly halfway on that string, 2/3 of the string, 1/3 of the string. And then that derived the diagram on the right, which was the monochord applied to the Earth, which is Terra, that circle on the bottom, that's Earth, and the distances of the planets and their orbits to Earth all also fell within mathematical geometric relationships that were tending to always fall within these sacred mathematical patterns. This is the reproduction of a monochord. So if you can look really closely at this monochord, you can see that there's a ruler along the edge here. There's a tuning peg on the left there. You can see there's one string going from bridge to bridge, and there's a movable thing in the middle there that can slide along to a different measurement ruler. So right now it's set at exactly halfway between the two bridges. And one of the things that Pythagoras noticed was that if you take the little thing in the middle away and just have the string stretched across, and you tune that string to some value, let's say 200 hertz, you tighten it up until it's 200 hertz, and you play it, and that string will have a big vibration that shows 200 hertz. That makes a certain tone. And if you put that little bridge finger in the middle there, exactly at halfway, it's like putting your finger on the string, except this is a wooden finger. And now we've divided the string in half. And if you pluck either side of that string of that middle bridge, then each of those two strings will be tuned to double the frequency of the open string, or 1 octave higher. And this is one of the big universal laws, law of octaves. So if I divide that string exactly in half, each of the two strings on either side of the division would be at 400 hertz. If the open string is 200 hertz, when you put your finger in the middle and divide it in half, each of the two strings on either side of your finger is double the frequency, 1 octave higher. And if you start to slide that wooden finger around on that scale where the measuring tool is, you'll see that at 1/3 and at 2/3 and at 4/5 and at 3/5, each of those divisions, the relationship now between the two sides of the strings begin to change, and that forms what we call chords, frequency relationships that form music, harmonious music. So the kind of frequencies that you would see on a piano and playing music, where you've got a C major chord or an A major chord or a minor chord or a 7th chord or a 6th chord or a minor 13th or whatever. Those are all relationships between specific frequencies related mathematically together in a sacred mathematical ratio that we consider to be pleasing and we consider to be music. When sound frequencies fall outside of these perfect relationships of 1/3, 2/3, 4/5, 1/2, things like that, we pick them up and we interpret them as being disharmonious and not pleasing to listen to. And the reason why our brains are wired that way is because our body is designed on the same mathematical principles that we see in music theory. That harmonic relationships of vibrational frequencies is what forms the quantum standing waves that form quarks and charms and hadrons and leptons and atoms of the periodic table, which make compounds, which make cells, which makes my body. So my brain has grown out of this, and my brain functions based on those same mathematical patterns and rules. So therefore, when I hear vibrational frequencies of sound that fall within the same mathematical relationships as the construction of my body, and the construction of my body was accomplished by a biological organic intelligence inside of me that knows how to grow my body out of two cells based on these principles, then this part of me, this deep part of me, a big mind, always seems to be pleased when it's presented with those patterns from the outside as art forms and fed back into itself, there is something pleasing about that. So when you look further out and you see that the same principles that are used to create the harmonic patterns, octaves and harmonics and overtones in nature and in my body and in how my brain works, it's also how the cosmos works. It forms the orbital diameters of planets around the sun, or the moon around the earth, or electron shells around, the nucleus of an atom. So it's all part of the same thing. As a matter of fact, the periodic table falls within octave relationships of different types of elements, and the structure of the atom itself, the relationship between the protons and neutrons in the nucleus and the electrons in the three shells on the outside and more, also is related to the harmonic sequences that we see governing music. So as we kind of delve a little deeper into Pythagoras, where we see over here on the right, that picture shows at the top is the open string, and the second one down, which is 1/2, is 1 octave, and plucking the string on the right and left would form a frequency that's twice the frequency of the open string. And then the next one down is 1/3 and 2/3, and the next one down is 1/4 and 1/2 and 3/4. And anyway, so we can see how this is going. It's going 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and we call that a fifth. 1/5 is a harmonic fifth, and a harmonic sixth, and a harmonic seventh. Each of those is what a string actually looks like when it's vibrating, and you can see that with a strobe light. You can strike a string and hit a strobe light next to it, and you can watch these string vibrations look exactly like that chart, because it forms a pseudo standing wave. It looks like it's standing still, but it's not. It's like the propeller effect, where a propeller starts to speed up and it becomes a blur, and then all of a sudden it looks like the propeller blades are becoming visible, that they're starting to kind of stop in the middle of the blur, and then they start to slowly rotate backwards. And that phenomenon has got to do with the fact that the speed of the rotation of the propeller blade is always in relationship to the speed of the neurons firing in your visual cortex, and they fire at a certain speed. And if the rotating blade reaches the 12 o'clock position at the same time as your eyes fire, then it appears to be standing still. And as later when we talk about chakras, we'll see that's why the chakras appear to have stable petals that were always described. 4 petals and 6 and 10 and 12 and 16 and 96 and 960 petals appearing to be standing still is really the propeller blade of the vibrational frequencies of the chakras synchronizing up with the visual cortex. We can also see the representation in a sound wave on the left on an oscilloscope. We'll see the fundamental at 50 hertz, and a harmonic third would be 3 times that. There'd be 3 sine waves within each master sine wave of the fundamental. Harmonic fifth would be 5 little waves in each big wave of the fundamental, and so on. All of them nest together nicely. They mathematically fit together, so that's why we read them as harmonious. So once we start to see that this idea that there's a master craftsman, so to speak, in Big Mind that participates in knowing how to grow my body out of 2 cells. But if I dig deeper down into this unconscious Big Mind of mine, it's possible to break through into higher dimensional connections of big mind, where it becomes collective big mind, where all of us participate in growing a planetary ecosystem that our bodies grow out of. And so from the primordial standpoint, accessing information from my own personal big mind would be using primordial sounds from my experience in the womb. And that's the reason why I wanted to explore this idea of womb sounds, to help the wake big mind for me up. And within there would be the information about, why am I here? What's my path? Why am I sick? What do I have to do to become whole? But then taking nature sounds and slowing them down and speeding them up and doing things to them so that only the unconscious mind can recognize them, would be targeting a deeper level of the collective unconscious mind that knows how to grow a planetary ecosystem that my body grows out of. And that led me to exploring, that led the universe handed me on a golden platter these NASA space sounds. And I'll devote an episode to the space sounds, because that's a pretty mind-boggling story. Collections of sounds from the planets, from Voyager 1 and 2, that come back and sound like dolphins and whales and Tibetan bowls and monks chanting and crickets and birds and choirs of voices coming from space. And it's the similar kind of thing you see when you take human voice recordings, speaking sentences, and speed them up. They sound like birds, and speed it up higher, sound like crickets, and higher, sound like dolphins. And you take cricket sounds and slow them down, and they sound like birds, and birds slow down, sound like dolphins, and dolphins slow down, sound like people singing. And all of those sounds sound like the sounds coming from outer space as well. So the whole thing is a collective unconscious construction of consciousness itself, and the point of view tends to fool us into thinking that we're all separate pieces, when in reality it's all part of one huge homogeneous holographic whole. So it led me to think, once I had space sounds, what are these space sounds doing? What aspect of my collective unconscious are they tapping, which is a deeper, broader collective unconscious part that I'm connected to, that knows how to grow a planetary ecosystem, a solar system ecosystem, a planetary ecosystem that my body grows out of, and a body ecosystem. Some self-organizing principle is at work here. And it extends beyond the solar system into the galaxy, and extends beyond the galaxy into the cosmos. And when we look at the rules that abide to control all of these various steps, from subatomic particles to super-galactic nebula and everything in between, we see the same rules repeating themselves over and over again. And these rules have to do with harmonics, overtones, octaves, geometrical relationships that arise from harmonious related mathematical sequences. One of the big ones that we're all familiar with is this idea of the Fibonacci series. The Fibonacci series, if you look in which kind of produces this very specific type of spiral called the golden section ratio spiral, the one that we see in the chambered nautilus. But if you see the little mathematical sequence in the upper left corner there of the white window, 0 plus 1 equals 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8. So we're adding the product number to the next number and ending up with a expanding sequence that goes forever. So the next in line would be, 8 plus 13, and that would equal number, and that number would be added to the next one, and that forms this spiral. And the relationship between each of those levels of 0 plus 1 equals 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3. The relationship between the 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 13 is the 1.614 that goes on forever. It's the golden section ratio is the relationship of one of these numbers to the next, and it forces this characteristic type of spiral. And you can see the spiral is expanding with each turn. Each turn of the spiral is getting larger, and it's getting larger by exactly 1.618. So I think I said 1.614 before. It's 1.618 is the basic golden section ratio, and it doesn't stop at the 8. It continues on forever, but it forces the spiral. And we see that spiral in pretty much everything in nature, and in particular we see that in the proportions of our body, in the formations of different plants, in the water going down the drain, in the spiral of your hair at the top of your head. It's the relationship of the dimension of this portion of my finger to this, and this to this, and this to that, and this to my elbow. Yeah, it's the relationship proportion of a line on the center of my nose to the inside corner of my eye, to the outside corner of my eye, to the outside of my head. All of those are golden section ratios. It's the dimension of my forehead to my nose, and my nose to my chin. It goes on and on and on. It's dimension of my hands, the dimension of my body. It's seen in nature in every place you look. On the left is the chambered nautilus, but it's the shape of the ear, it's the shape of the eye. It's actually what's used in computer science in facial recognition software. The facial recognition software is taking the measurements of various places on your face, the dimensional relationships, and it's cataloging those dimensions, and those are as unique as your fingerprint. The shape of your ear is as unique as your fingerprint. Everything about each one of us is a unique event in the universe. And, I was talking about that before with the harmonic overtone structure of the sound of your voice. It's the harmonic overtone structure of the tissue mass of your body reflected in your vocal cords. And when you blow wind across the vocal cords, it creates patterns of harmonics that makes your voice sound like you, and that's deeply recognizable at an unconscious level to the part of your collective unconscious that grew your body out of two cells. So I could use that as pattern recognition to wake up something in my deep unconscious mind by using my voice singing a tone that my equipment has shown me, my heart rate variability monitor and EEG equipment has shown me this tone causes your system to balance into this state of homeostasis, which is a prerequisite for healing and a prerequisite for finding out the truth about myself. So I can use science to find this spot and find it very precisely. And then there's relationships of this tone to all of its octaves, all of its harmonics, and some of those octaves are brainwave frequencies and states of consciousness. And we can use brain entrainment to entrain you to one of those and awaken you up. We can see that same kind of spiral pattern in all kinds of different nature systems, including in the lower right corner. You'll see it in the branching bronchioles of the lungs. Follow the same mathematical patterns. The spiral in your fingerprint. Even hurricane patterns, wave motions, tree designs, galactic nebulae. It's pretty mind-blowing once you start looking. And that's what, Da Vinci was all about. So this whole thing about the Vitruvian man, this man in the circle in the center picture here, that was Da Vinci's exploration of the golden section ratio. And during the Renaissance, just about all the artists in every kind of art form, including architecture, were exploring the golden section ratio. It's the big thing of the time. And you can, so what we've got here is what was called the squaring of the circle, a mathematical relationship between the radius of a circle and the area of a square, the area of a circle and the area of a square. So when we look at how he's dividing up the Vitruvian Man, he's exploring the ratios of the human body in lengths of fingertips to elbows to shoulders and belly button to chin and on and on. And you can see on the left and the right pictures, he's doing the same thing with the face, the divine proportions of the relationship between the bridge of the nose to the tip of the nose and the upper lip versus the lower lip to the chin, and on and on and on. That's what all these drawings are all about, exploring those ratios. Because if he made paintings based on these ratios and he arranged figures in the field of a painting in golden sectional ratios, the whole thing had a deeper, higher meaning and a deeper, higher impact on a level of my collective unconscious mind that used the same mathematics to design the universe itself. So it's why we see that in paintings. So you can see these paintings on the right. You can see the proportions of the Mona Lisa and all these in architectural forms, all conforming themselves to the golden section ratio, which made them have an added cosmic importance at an unconscious level. And then Michelangelo and his famous statue of David was taking Da Vinci's idea of exploring the proportions of the human body in drawings and turning it into a three-dimensional form. So basically the reason David is so famous is because Michelangelo took the task on himself to create the perfectly proportioned human male body, where every possible dimension is played out of the golden section ratio, of the proportions of face, body, arm lengths, all of it in three dimensions. And that's why it's so famous. It is the perfect geometrical human male form in its proportions, the divine proportion human being. And that's now bringing us to where they took this in India. The idea of mandalas and yantras, visual forms that were used to enhance meditation by staring at these geometric paintings. So it was an eyes open meditation. The yantras and the mantras, not the mantras, the yantras and the mandalas were all a visual form of eyes open meditation that would put you into a certain state. The mantras were a acoustic form where eyes are closed to put you in a different state. And they were using your own voice, a resonation of your voice. So a portion of that, if you use your own voice and chant, then you're resonating your own body tissues with your own voice and all of its harmonic and overtone structures feeding back into you of yourself, which has a way of awakening the deepest part of your unconscious mind that designed your body based on those same harmonic patterns reflected in your vocal cords being fed back into your tissues from the harmonic patterns of your own voice as you sing it. And for me, in my work, once I use high-tech devices to measure your autonomic nervous system and your brain waves, and we can see which exact frequency causes everything to come together, now we have a frequency, and we can calculate all of the octaves and the harmonics of that frequency, and some of those will be brainwave frequencies in various states of consciousness. And when we entrain you to one of those, we open things up, and we can open up in beta for the mind, and in theta for the emotions, and in delta for the physical body, and epsilon for the metaphysical body, and gamma and default mode network. We can explore all these regions of consciousness with a level of precision that's never been possible before in human history. So when we look at what they came up with India, so this diagram from India, the Sri Yantra, is 11,000 years old from this ancient stone that was dug up, which had the first indications of this pattern of triangles, this relationship of 9 triangles, and each triangle is a very specific area dimension, a specific shape, a specific mathematical type of triangle. And supposedly these 9 triangles and their interrelationships formed all the mathematics that was used by Big Mind to create everything in the universe. If you look at this ancient Sri Yantra on the left, the colored one, and you look at, there are 4 upward-facing triangles and 5 downward-facing triangles. The center triangle, which is upside down, the idea was to sit, meditate, and stare at that center triangle. If you can look at it right now, you look at that center triangle and you don't blink and you don't move your eyes. And in just a second or two, you'll start to see these shifting pattern relationships of triangles jumping out all over the place. There will be all kinds of different triangles that will become apparent as the dominant one, and different relationships of triangles will start to spin around. All of those relationships between the 9 triangles is an infinite number of possible relationships. So it's really how reality is created from math. And a yantra is, the definition of yantra in Sanskrit is instrument, and Shri is the highest, the most revered. So the most revered instrument of meditation was the Sri Yantra of all other yantras that were created throughout the history of India. This is the most ancient and the one that is the most revered, and the reason is because of the state of consciousness that it was supposedly able to bring you to. If we pick it apart, the one on the left is redrawn from an ancient Sri Yantra that looked pretty much similar to this. This one's much more precise mathematically. It's a little bit easier to see the triangles that way. And I picked that apart and one step further in the diagram on the right. And all of the, which I'll explain in a second, all of this grew out of a soundtrack that I created from all of this, from a project that I got involved with. It was a project I got involved with back in somewhere around 1990 or 91 or something like that. A good friend of mine, Jonathan Quintin, and you might look him up. Jonathan Quintin, Quintin. He's New Zealander, a good friend of mine for decades. He's one of the top sacred geometry people in the world, and he's got a series of pretty mind-boggling videos and presentations. He's associated with Nassim Haramein and the Resonance Institute. He's been a good friend of mine for years. So he was approached by Deepak Chopra, who I already knew through my association with doing 7 tapes with Louise Hay and becoming good friends with her. And that's another story which I'll maybe tell at some point. So because of his connection with her, he got to meet all these famous people like Deepak Chopra. And at one point, Deepak Chopra approached him to produce a presentation a visual presentation on the Sri Yantra. He was doing a conference in San Diego called the Seduction of Spirit, and the centerpiece of this 7-day workshop was the Sri Yantra. And so Jonathan and I did this presentation. He did the visual part, I did the sound part, and the result of that was me figuring out the diagram on the right. The idea was to convert mathematically the Sri Yantra into sound. And how I did that was the circle that encloses all 9 triangles would be the area of that circle, which is pi. That's high school math. I had to go back in my brain, but it's the upper one on the left. Pi r squared is the formula for the area, figuring the area of a circle. And then the formula in the lower right, which I actually had to look up, which is also high school math, is how do you figure the area of a triangle. So if I want to figure the area of the circle, it's pi r squared. And if I want to figure the area of one of those single triangles, maybe triangle number 1, then I use the other formula to figure the area of that triangle. And then I have a relationship between the area of the circle that encloses the area of the triangle inside of it. That's a ratio. And if I ascribe a tone to the area of the circle, say 100 hertz, then the area of the triangle related to the circle, which I can still remember, is 36.45 of the area. So it's the area of the triangle number 1 is a certain percentage ratio of the area of the circle that encloses it. So let's say that the area of the triangle is 39.8%, and the area for the circle is 100 hertz. Then 39.8% of 100 hertz is a new tone. That's precise to a couple of decimal points. And if you do that with every single triangle, you end up with 9 tones, 1 tone for each triangle, that are mathematically exact and precise in relation to the circle. And then if you generate each one of those tones as a sine wave, you have the scientific conversion of the Sri Yantra into sound. And that became a soundtrack, the Sri Yantra soundtrack, which is what we're going to listen to today, in which I will post on my YouTube channel for you to listen to. And that led me to do the same work for a lot of different sacred diagrams, like the Chartres Cathedral Labyrinth and a few others, which I won't have time to get into today, but I can bleed off into the next time with the labyrinth and what that sounds like. The important thing here is that the relationship of the tuning of the 9 triangles and the circle, it turns out that the relationship of this, they're all weird. The relationship of the tones are all weird. They don't form chords. They form some higher mathematical relationship that has a deep effect on the unconscious mind. It wakes something very profound, which was, in this case, Sri Yantra consciousness. And why was this Yantra the Sri? Why was it the king? Why was the highest revered when you stared at that central kind of circle? It was because of the state of consciousness it brought you to. And we discussed what that is previously. It's the Schrodinger's cat place, where a state of consciousness where I arrive at the tipping point of deciding what the next moment is going to be. I now arrive in a place where the next moment from now is the potential to be, but it's not yet until consciousness arrives in the scene. And the agenda is what my expectation is. And Sri Yantra consciousness is the highest possible expectation, where I have released everything and I allow the will of the universe to flow through me and create the highest expression of the next moment that could possibly be, heaven on earth. And that's where I'm going with all of this, because all of us throughout this series that I've been putting together here, is the central theme is, what is it that we want? What do we want of the world? And none of us are in a place in our small mind to understand what that is, or to flesh that out, or to know what to ask for. That part has to be released, and we have to consult the deepest part of us, where the real answer to that is. And Sri Yantra represents that place, historically for 11,000 years. This is the place where we find that answer. We release whatever our small mind considers to be a perfect world for us, which will always be buried with faults. We have to surrender whatever we consider that to be to a higher dimensional part of ourselves, where that answer truly is. And we can use brain entrainment to help bring us to that place. This is the most controversial soundtrack I've made, because people buy this soundtrack and divide into two big groups. One group says, this is the most profound thing I've ever heard. It put me into a place I've never thought possible. And the other group, I thought I was buying music and I want my money back. It is not music, and it's like nothing else that I've produced. It's a mathematical reconstruction of the visual diagram of the Sri Yantra converted into sound. It's odd and crazy and strange. And so, when I created this, based on the diagram I did on the right, the relationship of the tuning of each of those triangles falls within something called a critical bandwidth. And the critical bandwidth is where the brain can't tell that two tones in a binaural beat are two tones yet, because they have to be untuned from each other by a certain amount before I can hear that there's two. If they're tuned too closely together, my brain can't tell there's two tones. It hears one tone with a pulsing inside, and the pulsing is the binaural beat, and that's what entrains my brainwaves to a state of consciousness. And all of the 9 triangles inside this circle fall within a critical bandwidth of tuning of each other, which creates 9 levels of binaural beats. We're really creating a C. Maxwell-Cade brain pattern, an overall pattern of brain frequencies that form a pattern. I call it Sri Yantra consciousness. And once I have instead of a random tone for the circle, 100 hertz or whatever, I use the value of pi itself to generate the tone. And that means that the value of pi is 3.1416, that relationship that forms the circle, the relationship between the radius of a circle and its diameter, its perimeter. It's one of the most profound mathematical values in mathematics, is the value of pi. So 3.1416, if we start raising it by octaves, we double it and double it and double it, and after a few of those, we end up within the range of hearing at 25.133 hertz. 20 hertz is the lowest range of hearing. So once we cross the 20 hertz bridge, we're in the sound realm. So now the tone for the value of the circle, the value of pi, is 25.133 hertz, or any octave of that. So another octave, we have 50.26, 100.53, 201.062. Any of those tones is the value of pi, and forms a deep recognition explosion at the deepest part of my unconscious mind that use these mathematics to create reality. Also, the 3.1416 is, if it was presented to me as a binaural beat, would put me into pi consciousness. And that is the use of sacred mathematics to awaken some deep part of my collective unconscious mind that knows how to create the universe based on core mathematical principles like pi. And we can awaken that part up. We could use the Fibonacci series the same way. a relationship of one tone to the next advanced by 1.618, larger or higher frequency at each step. That would also awaken that part of the deep unconscious mind. So no one octave is correct. So I raised the octaves and reconstructed the whole diagram, the whole Sri Yantra diagram as 10 tones, with the lowest tone just above the 20 hertz mark, and generated that. And as a bone rattling, fluid moving soundtrack of relationships. And on the soundtrack, every 4 minutes it raises by 1 octave exactly. All 10 tones, 9 tones for the triangles and the 10th tone for the circle, raised by 1 octave. They double. And they keep doubling every 4 minutes until they run off the top, until the highest frequency runs above 28,000 hertz. And that forms 7 octaves, 1 for each chakra. So in reality, Sri Yantra consciousness is related also to each chakra. It's a chakra activating system, and you would never know it unless you converted it into sound and ran it forward like I did. So for this soundtrack, I have I've gone inside and I've pulled various sections of this soundtrack out, because we're not going to listen to the whole 30 minutes and watch it evolve. But it becomes these bone-rattling frequencies that go higher and higher, and pretty soon you feel them in your chest, you feel them in your throat, you feel them on the top of your head, you feel them going out of the top of your head. At one point they sound like flying saucers and voices singing. It's pretty mind-blowing listening to the entire thing, feeling that energy come right from your root to right out the top of your head. So we're going to explore various frequencies. This is the mind mirror pattern of the brain frequencies that result. This is what Sri Yantra consciousness looks like on an EEG. It looks very similar in a way to the awakened mind pattern that we talked about before, where the maximum amplitudes were in the alpha and theta zone, and it's similar here with the Sri Yantra. Most of the brain activity is in alpha and theta zones. It's a bit more complex than the awakened mind pattern. But this is what we're about to do here. So let's all get our headphones. Once again, this time, this will last for about 7 minutes. This time, our focus is going to be to surrender whatever we think in our small mind a picture of the perfect world might be that we're trying to help create with each other by creating a quantum tipping point, by aligning our brainwaves together in synchronicity in a mind link, listening to the same soundtrack. This time, our job is to release that, release whatever picture we have formed about what we think this world should be, and allow a vision of it to arrive to us through this Sri Yantra consciousness entrainment. So here we go. Thank you all. I have one thing I want to say before we stop here. This soundtrack will be posted as a download, and here's where it would be posted. It's posted on Scientific Sounds with an S, scientificsounds.com/sacred-sounds. scientificsounds.com/sacred-sounds. It's also listed in the description of the videos on both Facebook and on YouTube. It's in the body of the text. Also, along with that, I had some requests from various people when I went through comments the last time from the last live stream, who were requesting could they get a copy of the psychic boosting soundtrack that I played that was involved in the computerized psychic testing program from Duke University. That's the one that used the value of pi that I just described, the value of pi as a tone and a brain entrainment frequency related to the epsilon brain entrainment frequency for boosting precognitive ability and space sounds. I played a little bit of that, and I'm posting that on this same website with this particular track. So you'll find that one there as well. So thank you all very much. Until next time, peace and be safe.